Let's talk about death. Not in real life, that's far too emotional of a subject, but in video games. If I were to ask you right now, what does death feel like in video games? You'd probably answer with terms like a reset or restart, a setback, annoying, frustrating. What you probably won't answer is something like impactful, mournful, shocking, or even the end. Unless we're talking about hardcore or Iron Man game modes, death usually isn't the ending in games. It can't be, because that would untimely destroy the whole experience. As a game developer, death is something your game probably covers in some way, but the death of any character probably shouldn't be the death of the whole game. Death in games often only meets a handful of the feelings we associate with the concept. Frustration, anger, and sadness come to mind. But games usually deliver upon these feelings in ways that are very far removed from the emotional impact that death brings, even when it happens to characters in other media. Because of the interactive nature of the medium, making death truly final is difficult, if not flat out impossible for most games. That being said, there are games out there that handle death in very interesting ways and manage to deliver on more than just the intensely negative feelings. At the end of this video, I want you to be convinced that death in video games doesn't just have to be a reset. It doesn't have to be punishment for failing to overcome a challenge. It can also be a learning tool or even a very emotional narrative tool. But in order to do that, developers like you and I need to put a bit more effort into the deaths of our game's characters. Let's take a look at some of the most interesting ways games handle death, starting with death as a central game mechanic in roguelites such as Rogue Legacy. In this procedurally generated action platformer, you play as the descendants of Johannes, a traitorous knight who kills the king of Castle Hamson in order to assume power over the Fountain of Youth. The main game loop incorporates death in a very easy to understand way that plays into how inconsequential death is in most video games and takes it to the extreme. You play as the descendant of Johannes, enter Castle Hamson to try and collect as much gold as possible, and defeat the 4 bosses to gain access to the golden doors at the castle entrance. Eventually, you will most certainly die, but then you choose which of your descendants inherit your money and have to complete the quest that you couldn't. As soon as you pick your favorite child, the game loop restarts with them as a new start. Rinse and repeat. Rogue Legacy, like other games in its namesake genre, the roguelite, knows that death in games is usually a minor setback. Roguelites use this reset point to reset the game's experience, but they don't reset you all the way back to zero, unlike true roguelikes. These roguelites allow you to progress more and more over time, no matter your actual skill level. Each time you pay your fee to enter the castle, you return with more money to buy better gear and try again. This makes each death a moment to reflect upon your strategies and makes each run an opportunity to experiment. The randomized levels, character traits, and classes just add some much-needed variety and novelty to the whole experience. Now, Rogue Legacy has a very interesting way of handling death that ties into game mechanics, but it goes completely in the wrong direction if you're trying to make your deaths more impactful as a developer or game designer. For that, we can look at games like Undertale. You know all about this, so I'm gonna keep it short, but Undertale handles death of all characters extremely well, including the player character. If you die, you can reload and try again, but save scumming will be remembered by the game across different save files. The game actually does a lot outside of the inherent gameplay and mechanics to handle various narrative events. But within all of those, it keeps track of the deaths of all characters to influence how NPCs interact with you and even the whole storyline. Undertale has 3 main storylines, called the Neutral, the Pacifist, and the Genocide Run. Each of these very descriptive names tells you all you need to know about activating any of these runs. And it's made possible through one central game mechanic in Undertale: sparing the lives of your enemies. This was one of Undertale's major unique selling points, even way back when it was still in development. Spare everyone and you're on track for the pacifist ending, with fittingly wholesome and cutesy dialogue from all the NPCs. If you instead opt to kill everyone in cold blood, you're running towards the genocide ending. NPCs will know exactly who you killed and will be angry towards you or even afraid of you. If you pull through the pleas of their lives and commit to your heinous acts, you'll get a completely different ending too. If you stay somewhere in the middle, killing some minor enemies but sparing most, if not all, major NPCs, you will get the neutral ending. Not everyone may have made it there with you, but the story still ends. Now, I'm not gonna get too deep into all the meta-narrative of Undertale since my last video already covered meta-gameplay and narrative enough for the time being, but focusing on just death as a narrative tool, Undertale handles it very well. NPCs know exactly who is and isn't left alive and will act accordingly. If you're designing a game with major characters who are allowed to die, you need to keep track of all the edge cases like Undertale does. You don't want to leave players in a sequence-broken softlock state just because you as a developer forgot about something. The best way to handle this can be read between the lines of an interview with Toby Fox himself, conducted by Phaii in 2017. Each character has a consistent plot. Even though the world is set in a fictional one, I wanted the characters' thoughts and actions to be real and true. Although these monsters are enemies, they don't just exist alone. Even if they are not depicted in the game, they still have families, friends, goals, and live their daily lives interacting with various people. It's not just the person themselves that makes them who they are, but the people around them. It is also the people that they care about. In other words, they are monsters full of love. After all, love is what makes a person human, right? In short, you want to map out all your major characters as widely as possible. Why do they act the way they do? What do their lives look like? Who do they like, dislike, love, hate? What are their aspirations and goals in life? And how does all of that influence the decisions they make and the relations they have with other characters? And how does all of this evolve over time? When you have all of that mapped out, it becomes a much easier task to oversee how the death of certain characters would affect others, and to write different scenarios throughout the game for these occurrences. To get back into some more game mechanic-centric examples of how games handle death, let's take a look at one of the most unique systems within modern games, the Nemesis system in Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. In this game, you encounter lots of different orcs, and I mean loads of them. Each of which has a slightly different personality, appearance, voice lines, and rank within the grand hierarchy of each city in Mordor. When you encounter an orc for the first time, the game immediately starts tracking your behavior. For each situation, whether you manage to defeat an orc, run from the battle, get killed, or even small changes like shooting them with an arrow or slicing a limb off, the game records what happens for future reference. The next time you encounter the same orc, the game will have updated their traits to match what happened in your last encounter. If you shot the orc with an arrow, they will now have an arrow sticking out of them. If you defeated the orc, they may return in a lower rank, but with newfound energy from their drive for revenge. But if you were defeated in battle, the orc will probably have a higher rank and mention you've come back for a second beating. This creates an incredibly dynamic structure and makes each new orc you encounter immediately memorable. By doing this, Shadow of Mordor doesn't adapt how it handles death entirely, but builds upon the limitations of death in video games in a really interesting way, not only for the player character, but also for each enemy you encounter. If you want to know more about how this system works and what else is tracked to make the player experience unique every time, check out GMTK's video about it. He made a fantastic breakdown of the whole system that does it a lot more justice than I ever could, even if I didn't just focus on the characters' deaths. There are loads more games out there that I could cover that also have interesting ways of dealing with characters' deaths. Among these is Final Fantasy Legend II for the Game Boy. When a playable character dies in battle, they reappear at Odin's throne in Valhalla. At that point, the player is offered a choice: accept their fate in the game over, or reset to just before the battle they've lost. However, Odin doesn't give the player this opportunity without a catch. If the player wants to reset to just before the lost battle, they also swear to Odin to challenge him in battle someday. This point doesn't really come up again until about 90% into the game's main storyline. At some point during the dimension hopping, your party finds themselves in front of the gates of Valhalla. You battle your way all the way to that same throne room you've seen before in the death cutscene, and of course, Odin is waiting for you there. Your party tries to reason with the god, but he attacks you anyway. But the twists don't end there. You get to Valhalla because, in the game's narrative, your party is looking for a bunch of MacGuffins to save the world. However, after defeating Odin in battle, he just gives you the majority of them, revealing that he used them to become a god. The only reason he challenged you after your death is because he got bored of being immortal. Your party wasn't the first to be challenged by Odin, but they were the first to put up a good fight. After handing you the items you need and wishing you good luck on the final part of your journey, he finally accepts death. But this honorable mention doesn't end there. The developers over at Square thought of much more. After this encounter, when Odin is defeated, you actually lose the ability to restart after a death. Your only option is to reload from your last save. Unfortunately though, this example isn't completely flawless. The encounter with Odin is still baked into the main storyline and is entirely necessary to complete the game. As such, if the player hasn't died at least once in the game, the battle with Odin and his death happened pretty much without any dialogue. Taking inspiration from all of these examples, I've laid out some fun game mechanics for Blightwatcher's handling of the death of a player character, NPCs, and all creatures in the world. Let's start with that last one. In Blightwatcher, your player character has a bestiary. Each time you encounter a new creature, it immediately tracks how many of this creature are around in the whole game world. As long as there's at least 2 creatures left, or a single one if they can reproduce by themselves, the population will increase over time. The more of these creatures there are, the faster their population will increase, until they reach some kind of equilibrium point. This point depends on a couple of factors, including the conditions of the area the creatures live in and potential predators in the area. If you hunt down the last of a specific species, they are now extinct. You cannot encounter this creature again, unless Wexar, the god of growth and rot, decides to create this creature again from the required genetic material. This can rarely happen randomly, but you can also cause it to happen by collecting the necessary items and putting them together. At that point, you just have to wait for Wexar to do his job. Depending on your affinity with the god though, you might be better off convincing someone else to say some prayers for you. Wexar also keeps track of how many of his grand creations you've killed, and how many you've driven to extinction. I wonder how he feels about that. Secondly, there's the death of NPCs. In order to combat scope creep, I've decided that the main NPCs required for the story of Blightwatcher cannot die, at least for the demo. If there's enough time and development capacity to create narrative arcs for each main character's death for the main game, that might be a stretch goal for later, but at least in the demo, NPCs who are close to death will simply flee from battle and leave you to handle it on your own. That leaves us with one less death to handle, the player's death. In the lore of Blightwatcher, life and death are both granted by two separate gods. Wexar causes dead things to become alive, and Skadir causes living things to become dead. When the player is fatally wounded in battle, they aren't actually allowed to die. The player can lose various limbs and appendages, but their death can only be granted if Skadir allows it. Unfortunately, at least in the demo, Skadir simply doesn't allow it. Ever. The player can be fatally wounded and incapable of returning to a place to heal, but that just softlocks the game. When this state is detected by the game, it will clue the player in there's not much they can do anymore, and they should give up on their current quest. At this point, the player has no option but to reload from a previous save point. However, each softlock death is also tracked by the game. What effect this will have in the demo or in the full game, I'll leave as an experiment for you guys to figure out when the demo comes out. Now that Blightwatcher has... Okay, no, wait. Before we get into any of that, I just want to thank all of you for the massive support I've gotten on the last video. That one has truly blown up beyond anything I could have possibly imagined, and I got some great feedback on there too. Most of you seem to be very excited for Blightwatcher, and that makes me incredibly happy to see. And I even got some really constructive criticism about how to improve my videos in the future, so I hope this one did a lot better than the last one. I also got some less constructive criticism about how the concept of my video wasn't that great, and I do have to agree that my previous video's title and concept would have been a lot better if I addressed some of it more clearly in the video, but I thought this kind of conversation would get way too convoluted for a video that I was trying to make. That being said, I will keep all of this criticism in mind, and I will take all of your kind words to heart to make even better videos in the future, and I hope you will all stick around to see them. Alright, now we can go back to your regularly scheduled outro. Now that Blightwatcher has some not quite standard ways of handling death, I feel like the game has become more interesting at the outset, even just from the premise of how death is handled. The interplay of game mechanics and the game's narrative creates plenty of opportunities for me as a developer to do fun things with either, and I'm super excited to see how far I can stretch the effects of those in the full game. But before we get there, Phaii and I will be working hard on getting the demo ready for release. If you got some new ideas out of this video, or you want to share some other games that handle death in interesting ways, please leave a comment down below. If you got inspired to create something of your own from this video and you want to keep up with Blightwatcher's development, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next devlog. But until then, cheers.